Welcome, church. My name is Luke Fuge. I am the Youth and Young Adults Director here at East Main Church. And this week is the Thanksgiving holiday, a time for family, for reflection, and a time for gratitude. It's honestly one of my personal favorite holidays. We always go home to be with our parents for Thanksgiving. And we have this great family tradition where we have a tablecloth that we've had since 1994, where we write our name, our year, and 3 things that we have been thankful for over the past 3 years. And so it can range from things like I was thankful for in 1998, cats and grass. But it's fun to see our legacy throughout the years. My brother got his first deer in this year. I graduated high school this year. My mom started her job this year. And so it's a great tradition to see the ways that we've been able to be thankful for what God has put in our lives. But I also acknowledge that Thanksgiving is often not a time for many people for joy, but often a time for trouble. And this year in particular, we see trouble all around the world. And so we wonder how we're able to give thanks in the midst of it. And I think for the most part, we are troubled people, troubled in our bodies, in our relationships, in our family, in our workplace. We are troubled by our sin, and our sin welcomes it. But even in our best efforts, we are plagued by trouble. And Jesus himself acknowledges his trouble in John 16:33, where he says, "In this world you will have trouble." And yet in the midst of this nearly constant and complex troubles in our lives, Jesus also says a few chapters earlier in chapter 14, "Let not your hearts be troubled." And the Apostle Paul himself says, "Give thanks in all circumstances." And so if you're like me, you're wondering, how is this possible? How are we to give thanks in the midst of the burdens of our lives? Well, I don't think we have to look much further for an example than the person of Jesus himself. And just a few chapters later, after chapter 16, when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. I think it's fair to say that there has not been a more burdened person in history than Jesus is. Jesus was the Passover lamb. And like any Passover lamb, it was to be sacrificed. And in Jesus' case, a sacrifice on an agonizing cross. Jesus fully knew the price he must pay to take away the sins of the world, to receive the wrath of God's punishment. When Isaiah 53 says that he was to be crushed for our iniquities, that is not a metaphor, it was a spiritual reality. The Lord himself, who came into this world as a baby, would plead in bloody terror at Gethsemane for the Father's deliverance before the end. And so we acknowledge Jesus' trouble exceeds even our ability to measure it. Yet in the night before he was to be arrested and eventually crucified on a cross, he had a meal with his loved ones. He broke bread and he gave thanks. And with a heavy heart and anticipation of the horror that was to come later, he gave thanks to the Father, the very one leading him to his death. I don't think we should overlook the gratitude that Jesus gives here just because he was Jesus and he knew that it would all work out in the end. As if knowing it was going to work out was somehow going to ease the pain of death on the cross. But we do know that Jesus was able to endure what was to come because of his knowledge of God's promises. And we see this in Hebrews 12:2, where we see that we are to look to Jesus, who, because of the joy that was set before him, was able to endure the cross. So when Jesus tells us to give thanks and to not be troubled, we know that we have a high priest who is able to empathize with our trouble. And even more so, when Jesus says, "Let not your hearts be troubled," in John 14, that verse is in the midst of a passage where Jesus promises the Holy Spirit, a counselor who is able to help us to endure not promises to take away our burdens or our troubles, but to give us joy in the midst of it. And so, friends, it is possible to give thanks with heavy hearts in the midst of our trouble. By trusting in the Father and by looking at the example of Jesus and the promises that He gives us to help us endure to the end. Thank you, friends. I hope you have a blessed Thanksgiving holiday.